Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo, as always, joined by Joe Resinello. And once more, dear brothers and sisters, let us go in to the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. You know what I'm about to say. Download the app, share it with your friends. You'll have access to all of our station's content, not just the front line with Joe and Joe. Remember, of course, we are an EWTN affiliate, so you'll have all that content and Veritas original programming. And if you like what Joe and I do, we go live Thursday nights Eastern time on social media, X, Rumble, Facebook, YouTube. Veritas, as you know, is gracious enough to allow us to take these interviews and post them on social media. So help us out. If you like what we do, wherever you see us, like, subscribe, share, do all that fun stuff. Today, we are definitely going into the breach because we have on Robert Royal. We're very proud and honored that Robert has decided to come on the show, and we're going to be discussing his new book, The Martyrs of the New Millennium. Joe Resinello, talk about going into the breach. And because not something that a lot of people talk about, but Bob wrote a book about it, and that's what we're going to discuss. Now, that's going to be available at Sophia Press. We always ask that we support our Catholic publishers along with our Catholic authors. So I will post a link in the description. You buy the book there. And you get a 15% discount because you know Joe and Joe, and that's always a beautiful thing. Now, many of you know Robert Royal. Okay, he needs no introduction to our audience. However, for those out there who do not, Robert Royal is the founder and president of the Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C., and editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing, an online publication that appears daily and is translated into 5 foreign languages. He writes and speaks on questions of ethics, culture, religion, and politics. He appears on television and radio stations around the United States, including, as many of you know, on EWTN. He's part of the Papal Posse with Raymond Arroyo and Father Gerald Murray, and has lectured in 15 foreign countries. His most recent book, A Deeper Vision, The Catholic Intellectual Tradition in the 20th Century. His other books include Dante Alighieri, The Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century, A Comprehensive Global History, The Pope's Army and the God That Did Not Fail. Royal holds a BA and an MA from Brown University and a PhD in comparative literature from the Catholic University of America. He's received a Fulbright scholarship and fellowships from the Renaissance Society of America. Robert Royal, welcome to the front line with Joe and Joe.
Great to be with you. It's the first time I've had two Joes interviewing me, but I guess that's the first time for everything.
Well, it does, quite frankly, make it easy for you. You all you have to do is say Joe. One of us is going
Right,
to answer. We
right.
promise. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the other Joe Resinello, and we'll have a great conversation.
Bob, we always start with a prayer to Our Lady in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, never was it known that anyone who sought your help or sought your intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto you, a virgin of virgins, our mother. To you we come, for you we stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in your clemency hear and answer us. Amen. In the
Amen.
name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, we were talking to Bob before the show. We actually have some ties to Bob. Obviously, as Joe Pasillo rightfully said, we've had the Papal Posse. Now we have the whole Papal Posse. We've had Raymond on. We've had Gerald Murray on a number of times. He's a friend of the show. A quick little story. I was in St. Patrick's Cathedral waiting to go to confession at lunch, and Raymond was walking like a million miles an hour. You would have thought he was a New Yorker, how fast he was walking. He didn't recognize me. I said hello to him very quickly. Um, when he came on the show, Bob, he canceled on us like 5 times. 5 times. I was waiting to go to confession. I was going to tackle him, to be honest with you. I was like, Raymond. But he what's it called? We had a nice little conversation. And like I said, we're grateful to have you. And now we have all 3 of you guys. Also, we had a nice conversation with your brother in Ridgefield, who's a priest. He's a very good man and a very smart man. So, welcome. I want to talk a little bit about your work in martyrdom with regard to the 20th century. I read a book that you start off with that. I read a book that you wrote on that a while ago. Is that what kind of bridge to the 21st century? Because we're kind of new to this century. And that book I thought was very good. Could you talk a little bit about that, and then we can go into this book?
Yeah, in some sense, both of these books are really kind of a little bit outside of my normal path. You mentioned some of my other books, and generally I kind of write about historical subjects and philosophy and theology and literature, things like that. But actually, this is another tie to Connecticut just before the year 2000, which was another Jubilee year. This year, 2025 is a Jubilee year as well. There were people at St. Aloysius in New Canaan who had amassed a tremendous amount of material about martyrs. It's just by accident, some people gave them some things, and then other people heard about it, and they were sending it. And they asked me, what do we do with this? I said, well, we ought to do a book about this. So in 2000, I did this vast survey of martyrdom in the 20th century, which came out as the Catholic Martyrs of the 20th century. And it really is a kind of a global summary. You can't do everything because it's a huge subject, but I kind of gave a global overview, and it was relatively easy because back then we already had books and studies of the main sources of modern Christian martyrdom, mainly totalitarianism, communism, Nazism, fascism, things like that, so national security states. And that was a fairly easy thing for me to write, although, as I say, it wasn't really what I would normally have chosen myself. This time around, and I gave a copy of the 20th century martyrs to John Paul II on May 7, 2000, because he had a big event at the Colosseum celebrating all the Christian martyrs, not just the Catholic martyrs, but the Christian martyrs, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, at the Colosseum on May 7, 2000. Well, this year, Pope Francis decided he wanted to reproduce that commemoration of the martyrs. And so in May of 2025, and I'll be going over to Rome for this, there's going to be a similar celebration of the 21st century. Now, you're right, we only have 25 years. And frankly, it was much harder to write this book because we don't have a lot of studies. And I think that the key, if the listeners want to understand the difference between then and now, is as Salman Rushdie, the Indian novelist, has said, we got over the totalitarianism of communism, fascism, and Nazism, only to discover a new totalitarianism in Islamic fundamentalism, and that's where most of the 21st century martyrs are now coming from, radical Islam.
Robert Royals joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please go out and buy his new book, which we're discussing today, The Martyrs of the New Millennium. It's available at Sophia Press. Please click the link in the description, and it'll take you right to the website, and you can buy the book there. Bob, let me ask you this. Joe and I like to define our terms, okay? What do when we say the word martyr, well, obviously most people have a fairly good idea of what it means. In your book, you spell it out. This is what a martyr is. Talk about what's meant by the word martyr and what's the difference between a white martyr and a red martyr.
Well, I'm glad you brought this up because in the introduction to the 21st century book, I take great pains to parse this out because some modern popes have changed a little bit the definition of what the church believes a martyr is. And by the way, in public, you see that there are people who are Islamic martyrs, they're suicide bombers and whatnot. And in a certain radicalism of Islam, that's a term that's used. Catholics and other Christians do not believe in blowing yourself up for the sake of the faith. We don't believe in courting death or deliberately killing ourselves for the sake of the faith. So we want to be careful within the Christian orbit of what we mean by martyr. Now, I mentioned those totalitarian martyrs. It's pretty easy to see that they're directly targeted. They're very often clergy. They can be religious, women or men or whatever. They're very often targeted. You think of Maximilian Kolbe, Edith Stein, other people like this, because Christianity is a resistance to injustice. I mean, we just know that as Christians, we try to defend human life wherever it is. And so we can see very easily the martyrdom, and it has affinities with the older martyrdom. We're all brought up to read about ancient Rome and the way the Roman Empire martyred early Christians. The difference in the modern world, and there have been a couple of saints, both John Paul II and Francis have added some refinements. John Paul talks about what he calls the nuovi martiri in Italian, new martyrs. And one of the examples I often give is a priest in Sicily who was anti-mafia. His name was Pino Puglisi. And he was killed by the mafia because he was resisting them and trying to protect people in his parish and whatnot. So you start to see that what could even be regarded almost as half of a secular situation might produce a martyr. Now, Francis has gone even a bit further. He's talked about how it is that a person sort of on the spur of the moment offers his life. He actually came up with a new Latin term, oblatio vitae, the oblation or the offering of life, which has happened in the Middle East, frankly, and in Asia, where people they see there's a famous case of someone who's going to be canonized, actually, of somebody who grabbed an Islamic suicide bomber and said, "I'm going to die, but my people are not going to die," and he gets blown up along with a suicide martyr. So, yeah, there are these various definitions, and it's worth paying attention to this because people have died from very, very bad causes. There have been people who have been martyrs for communism and fascism and whatnot. But the church has refined that in various ways. And I'm glad that you asked about this because we don't want our Christian people to be just confused that anybody who dies for whatever cause is, quote unquote, a martyr. A martyr in Christian terms is someone who is saintly and has, like Jesus, in a sense, has offered his or her life for the sake of the gospel.
Thank you for that. Robert Royals joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Rossinello, where do you want to go?
I just want to expand on what you just spoke about. Francis's new term, because he's always reaching to the margins. And I always, to be honest with you, always give him the benefit of the doubt. Always. Is that definition just for Catholics? That instantaneous giving of self? Could it be for someone else who just basically, a good Samaritan? Basically, you use the example of a bomber who basically just says, offers his or her life for the other, which is a very Christ-like act. Could you get a little bit more specific? Because when you mentioned him, I instantly thought, is he reaching again outside of the realm of, say, a stricter definition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, look, I'm not an authoritative person in the sense that I speak for the church, so I'm just going to respond to with a good pointed question in a way that I understand it. Francis has actually allowed the church to include there's 70 Orthodox Christians who were beheaded by Muslim extremists in Libya recently, like in recent years. And he's allowed them to be included in the Roman martyrology. So this goes to what you're talking about. He's reaching out a little, and it's a little hard to say if they're not exactly Catholics, how are they inside what we regard as the list of martyrs? But I think in that instance, he's exactly right to include it. In fact, he and John Paul have talked about there's an ecumenism of blood that takes place when Christians are killed for specifically resisting things in the world. Now, whether it goes beyond that, I don't know. I mean, we'd have to defer to the church in making definitive pronouncements about who's a martyr, because to be a martyr is to be a saint. It's to be declared that you're in heaven. And so, we have to wait in many cases, even for Catholics, to be authoritatively designated that way by the Pope, and in a formal way. Although there's an infamous case of a Father Jacques Hamel, who was beheaded in France back about 10 years ago while he was saying Mass in France by two Muslim extremists. And Francis immediately said he's a martyr. So, look, we may be getting a little bit more generous, or the term may be becoming a little bit more elastic, but I think some of that is going to have to be sorted out authoritatively by the church. And Francis has actually done quite a bit. He's published a couple of documents that, like I say, he's come up with this new term, the offering of your life, oblatio vitae. And I'm kind of sympathetic to that way of approaching, because it seems to me by I think reliable estimates, there are over 300 million Christians in the world who are under threat of persecution and martyrdom, and we got to recognize these brothers and sisters in the faith.
No, absolutely, Robert Royal. I mean, it's one of the things that Joe and I get very frustrated about is that, Christian persecution, which is not us saying, oh, woe to us already. It's the reality of the situation. 300 million is approximately, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob Royal, It's got to be about what, 15-20% of the world's Christian self-identified. That's a lot of people.
A lot of people.
That's an awful lot of people. Let me throw this out there to you. I've thought a lot and spoken a lot, particularly on this show, about the aggressive atheists going back about 20 years, Hitchens and the whole bunch. All right, what I like to call that horrid crew. And one of my arguments to atheists that I meet, generally speaking, is that the church shouldn't be here according to your standards. It should not exist if you just looked at the world, if you had a materialist worldview. Nero, arguably one of the most powerful figures in all of human history at the moment that he reigned in Rome, should have been able to snuff these people out very quickly. But that didn't happen. And as Tertullian said, their blood was the seed of the church. Okay. I want you, if you don't mind, Bob, I want you to tie that into what you call the early Christian martyrs who wrote one of the first quote unquote books of spirituality. Because I always look at it this way. I have to take, we all do, the example of the martyrs, because as they gave their life, the church was growing. It wasn't going anywhere. It was here to stay. I think you know where I'm going with that. I'm going to throw it over to you.
Yeah, it's a funny thing if you think about it, that uh, basically an obscure Palestinian guy who grew up in a carpenter's shop is killed in Jerusalem, and it changes the face of the world, right? I mean, we are spiritually the heirs of the Jews, but what distributed that monotheistic vision of the world everywhere? I mean, because in a way, even Islam, which is over 1 billion people, is an offshoot of Christianity. What did that? He was Jesus. I mean, it's this obscure guy who gets killed. And I remember when I did the first Martyrs book, I gave a lot of lectures in different places to people who were very interested in martyrdom and how modern martyrdom was like ancient martyrdom. And we read the accounts of those early martyrs and kind of get inspired by the way they resisted. And we don't know much about modern martyrs. A woman asked me after one of my talks, during the question and answer, weren't you depressed reading about all these people and having to write about all these people who were killed, tortured, all this terrible stuff? And I said to her, it never crossed my mind. I was reading about these people who are virtual contemporaries of ours, and I've never spent so much time with so many great people. These are people who are willing to do the right thing no matter what it was going to cost them. And it was not only inspiring to read about it, but I think it has tremendous relevance to us living our daily lives, because let's face it, there is more and more. I write about this in the book, by the way. There is more and more, if not outright persecution, pressure on Christians, even in America, even in Europe, because we're supposedly homophobic and transphobic, and we hate women, and all the things that we typically are accused of being. So, this is something for all of us to know about. I mean, know about it because we need to honor our contemporaries who, like the ancients, were willing to give up their lives for the faith, but also for ourselves, that we need to be formed and recognize that you never know the day or the hour that we may be called upon. I mean, pray to God it doesn't happen here. I don't think it's likely to happen in the near future, but Jesus himself said that the world will hate you because of me. And a Christian needs to have that in mind. We're never going to be loved by everybody out there. And so quite a few people are going to hate us in ways that could be quite dangerous.
I think that's one of the things that let me say it is one of the things that Joe and I talk about all the time. And it's not a unique thought that we have. It's the phrase is it's the last accepted bigotry in America. Bill Donahue has been on the show a number of times. He's constantly talking about this anti-Catholicism in America. Joe, if you don't mind, let me stay with Bob on that for a second, okay? If everybody knows, let's say in my workplace, Bob Royal, that I am a Catholic. I'm a practicing and faithful Catholic. Okay. And I say something, somebody asks me a question about gay marriage, let's say, and I give an answer that the popular culture isn't exactly going to go along with, and I lose my job. Is that martyrdom? Because if I can't feed my family, but yet I did not shy away from what we believe as Catholics. And I'm not asserting this. I'm asking sincerely what you think about that. And I lose my job, and I have now a hard time feeding my wife and son. That's it's not death, but that's an awful lot of suffering that we're going to have to go through. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you asked earlier, and I'm sorry, I forgot to respond to this, the difference between red martyrs and white martyrs. I mean, usually what we say, red martyrs are people who actually die or maybe they're tortured or whatever. White martyrs don't die. I mean, we're more actually like confessors. I mean, I have a lot of friends who would like to claim that they're white martyrs because they're doing things and they're suffering as a result of it. And there's certain actually quite apart from the humor of that there's a certain plausibility to it. But yeah, I mean, you think about this, um, and John Paul and Benedict, Pope Benedict, have written about this that there is a kind of a civic death they talk about that takes place that you get ostracized, maybe you lose your job, maybe your friends and your family don't want to talk to you because I don't know, you came out against trans or something in public that seems to be a shibboleth these days. I mean, we're supposed to bow down. We don't bow down to golden cats anymore, but we do bow down to sexual minorities in all sorts of crazy ways, right? So yeah, I mean, look, it's happening right now. I mean, there are school teachers losing their jobs because they refuse to use pronouns. And by and large, these are people who are Christians and very often Catholics, because what is the only institution in the modern world that can really stand up to the wokeness and the kind of generalized elitism in the society? It's the church. As troubled as the church is, and as much as people like us are worried about what's happening in the church and the loss of people who are leaving the church, it really is the only institution, as an institution, that has the strength and the presence to stand up. And that is great. It's something that we need to use to advance the true and the good and the beautiful in the world. But it also exposes us to a lot of hate and potentially violence.
No, absolutely. If you're just joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, we're honored to be joined by Robert Royal. He has a new book out, The Martyrs of the New Millennium. Please click the link in the description that I will post there to Sophia Press. And please not only purchase the book, but please purchase the book from the publisher. Let's support Sophia Press and all of our Catholic publishers. Joe, we have a few minutes before the break. Where do you want to go?
I want to talk just briefly about the grace of martyrdom, because it's very easy to kind of talk about this, but it's a supernatural grace to give your life. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at. And I kind of want to tie it to something that I experienced when I visited Auschwitz. And many times you'll hear in the press, and it's a very powerful experience if you ever are fortunate enough to go there. They'll say, I survived a concentration camp. We survived. And when I went there, you go through the various halls and you see they took pictures of the people who came through and they show the dates. Came in March, died in May. Came in March, died in April. And basically, when you see these countless pictures of people, men, women, and children, and you see the horrors and what they went through, the takeaway for me was you didn't go there to survive. You went there to die. And what you had to endure was it was inhuman. They didn't feed you, they worked you to death. You could be Herschel Walker. You're dying, and you're dying quickly. You're not going to eat, you're not going to drink enough fluids, you're going to die. So it was by the grace of God that you survived such an experience. Well, let's kind of bridge that to the grace of a martyr. You're not going to will your own death. Even the most noble of human beings, that's a grace to basically, in the face of death, stare death square in the face and basically say, I'm going. I don't care. Talk about that, because I think we could just trivialize it, like to say, like, oh, like I could do that, or that person. No, that's a grace, and to be honest with you, it's something that's supernatural.
Yeah, I think you've said that quite well. And for people who can't get over to Auschwitz, the Holocaust Museum here in Washington is really quite extraordinary. It gives you that sense as well. Yeah, I think one of the dangers, or one of the perils, to put it this way, of um, overly idealizing the martyrs is that we tend to look at them and say, oh yeah, they were these special people. They were always, heroic, and they were much different than I am. And I don't, I could never live up to what they did. In fact, if you read carefully into the lives of most martyrs, yeah, there are those extraordinary figures. I mean, there's no question, particularly some of the early church fathers, they were extraordinary human beings. Rome was the greatest thing in the world at that time, and they stood up to it. But I think more often, and this is, I think, especially true of modern martyrs, more often they're ordinary people like you and me. I mean, they're Catholics, they're going to mass, going to confession, communion, participating in parish, this and that. And then one day they're asked to do something extraordinary. And they never thought that this was going to happen, or they, in some cases, didn't even give any impression to anybody who knew them that they could do such a thing. And so I think you're right that I mean, everything is grace in a way, but in martyrdom, there's a special grace that God gives people. I read it, I don't know how many accounts of martyrs and potential martyrs. I don't know that there was a single instance in which a martyr cursed the person about to kill him. That there was for Christ-like forgiveness, kind of they know not what they do, and praying for the very person who's about to shoot you or cut your throat or whatever. Um, that's grace. I mean, that's a grace like most of us can't we can't count on, and we can't even necessarily understand, but we look at it and we have to recognize it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Robert Royal, before we take a break, I'm going to post a bunch of links in the description, but tell our audience where they could find your work, what you're doing, all that fun stuff. Maybe
Yeah.
social media.
Look, I've been living for over 30 years in Washington, D.C. I was the vice president at Ethics and Public Policy, another think tank. I founded Faith and Reason Institute in 1999 here in Washington. And so we do conferences, we publish books, we write articles, we appear on the radio, we do TV shows, all of the public, kind of the public face of Catholicism in general. So you can go to the website, frinstitute.org, or you can go to thecatholicthing.org, all lowercase, thecatholicthing.org, and you can subscribe to the Catholic Thing, which is a very brief one. I'm very much of a stickler about this. It's 1,000 words. Some of my authors think that they need two, three times that amount. And I'm just ruthless in this because I really think our charism is brevity. So a lot of our readers write me and tell me, with the first cup of coffee in the morning, I sit down, I read 1,000 words from a trusted author on some subject that I'm interested in. And you can subscribe to the Catholic Thing, thecatholicthing.org, for free. We welcome donations, and there's a way to do that on the page as well. But if you subscribe on the website, it'll come into your inbox every morning at 6:02 in the morning. You can read it then. You can read it later in the day, whenever you want. You can even come back to it later in the week with it. It's all stacked up there. So you can become familiar with a lot of authors like Father Jerry Murray, who writes for us regularly, and many others who you might want to be following. And it's a convenient way to do it. I read it because I'm the editor of it one day before everybody else reads it. And I love it. I love reading it myself.
Well, and I'm going to say, so do I. Robert Royal's joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. We're going to take a quick break. Please go out and buy his book, The Martyrs of the New Millennium, available at Sophia Press. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe, Joe Pasillo and Joe Rossinello. We are way in the breach with Robert Royal. We're discussing his new book, The Martyrs of the New Millennium, that's available at Sophia Institute Press. Please click the link in the description. It'll take you right to the website. And when you do so, you'll be able to get a 15% discount because you know Joe and Joe. So, Joe Rossinello, where do you want to start this segment?
Bob, where currently are the most martyrs basically giving their life in the world right now? Is it the Sudan? Is it China? Is it someplace that would surprise us?
Well, actually, there are several parts to that answer. You wouldn't believe this, but the most dangerous place to be a Catholic priest in the modern world is Mexico.
Wow.
And it's not because of But Mexico used to have an anti-clerical revolutionary government at the beginning of the 20th century, and there was the Cristero War, and hundreds of thousands of people died in Mexico during that sort of totalitarian clash with Christians. But these days, and this is just priests now I'm talking about, it's perilous for priests in Mexico because of the cartels. We read about this with regard to the dangers of people coming across the border from Mexico, but internal to Mexico, there are the cartels, and there are also kind of satanic movements. This is bizarre, but there's this Santa Muerte, this Holy Death, who is a kind of a spin-off of the Virgin Mary, but a diabolical spin-off that has kind of found its life inside the cartels as well. So there's a spiritual, demonic side to this inside the cartels, and then there's just the usual criminal drug trafficking, human trafficking, and criminality. So that was to me quite surprising. I wasn't so much surprised when I did the earlier book because of the anti-clerical regime in Mexico, but that's a surprise that I think most people would not expect, but it's been documented and it's true. Other than that, there are a lot of people being persecuted and martyred still in the Middle East. The rise of ISIS and the radical movements in the Middle East was suppressed somewhat by the United States and allies in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And it's now coming back a bit. There's been a change of regime in Syria in which a former designated terrorist has become temporary president of Syria. And of course, the disorder in many countries in the Middle East, Lebanon, Israel, Syria, Iraq. I mean, all of that contributes to persecution of Christians. And we're seeing a lot of violence happening in Syria. So some of that Middle Eastern Islamism is still going on. But the biggest unknown area, it seems to me right now, is Central Africa, because although ISIS was suppressed to a degree in the Middle East, a lot of it moved to Central Africa. So in the Democratic Republic of Congo, right now in these days, there are a lot of Christians who are being persecuted and killed. I mean, there's been an uprising and there's a scramble for rare earth minerals and diamonds and whatnot in the Congo. The worst by far, though, is Nigeria. Nigeria produces about 5,000 Christian martyrs, Catholic and others, per year. You think about that, 5,000 year in and year out. And this is by African standards, a fairly wealthy country because they have oil reserves and whatnot. And unfortunately, during the Biden administration, they removed Nigeria from what is called the list of the countries of particular concerns, CPC. I don't know why they did it. Aid to the Church in Need, which was one of the sponsors of my book, in fact, asked me to do the second book, has persuaded Congress to pass a sense of the Congress saying that the administration should put back Nigeria on the countries of particular concern, but it hasn't happened yet. I think Trump will get around to that. But it's not only in Central Africa. I mean, that same radical Islamism has moved out to the Far East. I mean, you see it in a lot of different places. I mean, there's the Muslim persecution in Pakistan, which is just a crushing weight on Christians in Pakistan. Same is happening even in Hindu India, that the Hindu extremism is persecuting Christians. But it's in those countries that you probably don't ever read about much in the general press. I mean, I follow this stuff now regularly because of my book, and I'm shocked at how quickly, even say Syria, where there's a change of regime, you would think people would want to follow what's going on there. There are days and weeks that go along when we're not reading anything in the New York Times or the Washington Post about it. So, look, we've got to take the bull by the horns and keep this before the eyes of, first of all, our own Christian people, but also for the rest of the world.
No, absolutely. Robert Royal, I want to shift for a second from the attacks from without, let's say Islam, or you brought up Islam, and talk about the attacks from within. And what I mean by that is, now this might sound a little conspiratorial, right? However, Joe and I talk on the show all the time here, Bob, at the front line with Joe and Joe about globalism, about the particularly like European figures that promote globalism. Joe and I are of the opinion that it is systematic anti-Catholicism. Now, we say that, we understand that other people are persecuted. Don't get me wrong, okay? And I want your opinion on this. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I want your thoughts on this. And we just look at it as, okay, we mentioned white martyrdom before. All right, they're not going to turn around and throw you in camps or let's say or burn you like Nero burned the Christian martyrs and lined the streets of Rome. But there does seem to be like this almost commandment, this globalist commandment that thou shalt not espouse Catholic views on abortion, on transgenderism, on homosexuality, and other things, and they impose it. They impose it. What are your thoughts on that? Because that, to me, that's an enemy within. Catholic Church built Western civilization on the ruins of the Roman Empire, and Western civilization has turned its back on, obviously, Catholic teaching, Catholic tradition, stabbed the Catholic Church in the back, and on some level is persecuting the church and individual Catholics. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, in terms of sort of the cultural pressures and cultural, I mean, we talked about losing your job over saying something that is not politically correct. I mean, all that kind of stuff that's going on inside our Western cultures, which is really anti-Christian. I mean, they can't admit it openly, but that's what it boils down to. Um, I think all that is not only something we can suspect is out there, it's documentable. And I'll give our listeners a couple of reference points. There's a group that's based in Vienna, in Austria, that is called the Observatory on Anti-Christian Acts in Europe. You can look this up online. If you just go to Observatory on Anti-Christian Acts, it'll take you there. And this is a group that uses the European Union's standards of what constitutes discrimination and religious and anti-religious discrimination too. They use the very standards that the globalist international institutions have implemented and ratified to point to what is happening in Europe. And what's happening in Europe, in almost every country in Europe, a lot of this is related to massive Muslim immigration, but it's also, I think, driven by some anti-Christian attitudes. There are 700, 800, 900 events throughout Europe every year, and they document. You can give you references to the newspapers that are reported in Spain or Italy or France or wherever it is, and in England as well, unfortunately. And this is quite remarkable because it's not only the case that we as Christians feel this, it's by its own standards that the modern world is failing to recognize this stuff. And my final chapter is about a lot of this sort of thing. I think that even the reason why we never hear about Africa or Asia persecuting Christians is a lot of people who are in our elite culture, in journalism, et cetera, media of various kinds, they're not interested. I just don't think that it matters. Or if it does, Christians kind of have to deserve what they're getting. Now, our own Catholic bishops here in the United States put out a report, I think it was last year, 2024, over the last 4 years or something. There are several hundred instances of anti-Catholic vandalism, desecration of churches, et cetera, et cetera. And we just had this case out in Kansas City, or I guess it's Wichita, Kansas, of the Satanist who went into a church there, I think it's St. Patrick's Church, and desecrated statues, wrote some satanic stuff on the walls. This is everywhere these days, and it's for a moment it's in the news because it's shocking, and then it disappears. And there's a kind of an elitist assumption that it's almost kind of okay to do this because, of course, Christians are so judgmental and they're nasty. I mean, all this lying that goes on. And the case that I use to I think highlight what this really means is, and I'm sure you're both familiar with this, is that there was a story came out a few years ago that these churches these government schools up in Canada were being run partly by Christian organizations, including the Catholic Church, because the government would found these churches in Indian areas or wherever it is, And they didn't want to run them themselves, so they would hand them off to the local church and have them run these schools. And there was a claim, because some aerial radar took a picture, there was a claim that there were hundreds of unmarked graves near one of these former schools. So this caused a great outcry. Christians, we're killing these young Native Americans and whatnot. And so there were 30 some odd churches burned in Canada as a result. The Pope went to Canada, apologized for this. And just a couple of weeks ago, the Canadian government, which I think was not all that friendly to the Catholic Church, I don't think that's an exaggeration at all, declared that it was going to stop the investigations into this because they haven't found any graves. So here we went through 3 or 4 years of this hysteria that the church did this horrible stuff to Native peoples. And then the facts come in, facts as ascertained by an unfriendly Canadian administration, that never happened. But it's kind of assumed that, of course, it must have happened because Christians are evil. And we can even burn their churches down. I mean, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, he said a good thing. He said, this is not a good response to what happened. And as we now know, didn't happen. But it's not a good response, he said. But then he went on and he said, but it's understandable. Really? You think something happened in the past and it's okay to burn churches in the present? No, no civilized society can do that. But it's okay because it's Christian.
Robert Royal, I got to tell you this. Just when I hear, like, I'm notorious for I get a little angry sometimes here at the front line with Joe and Joe.
No, I can't
and the vein
believe that.
pops out of my head. and when you mention Justin Trudeau's name, that is one of those triggers for that vein to come flying out in a pronounced way because of what you just said. Like, well, it's understandable, but thank God, and I'm not just saying this, thank God for people like you. And Joe and I, we have our small part to play. Hopefully it's a larger part down the road to make these things known. As Bishop Fulton Sheen famously said, nobody hates what the Catholic Church stands for. They hate what they think the Catholic Church stands for. So we have to, part of our job is to raise the consciousness of people as to what the church actually teaches, what church history actually is. You mentioned a very relevant thing because obviously this was a recent event just in the last few years. If we don't open our mouths, people just would go on believing that. So we have to use we have to use these tools, particularly new media, social media, because heaven knows traditional media doesn't want our views on MSNBC and the rest of them. But Justin Trudeau tends to the mention of his name tends to get my blood boiling a little bit. Robert Royal is joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe Pasillo, Joe Resinello. We're way in the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, the Martyrs of the New Millennium. That's available at Sophia Institute Press. Please click the link in the description, take you right to the website. You'll get a 15% discount because you know Joe and Joe. Joe Resinello, where do you want to go?
I want to expand on something you said. You basically said it's intentional. And I experience this. I work in corporate America. If you mention certain things, you are absolutely done. You're done. Like, you don't believe in same-sex marriage. I'm a Catholic. Of course I don't believe in same-sex marriage. That's a given. It's a teaching. It's perennial. And that doesn't make me a bad person. But it's intentional. And what do I mean by this? It's messaging. What we're seeing, and I'm interested in your thoughts because I'm sure you have an opinion on it as well. They're trying to divide Christianity into buckets. If you believe what the church teaches, you are a fundamentalist, you are evil, you are bad. And they're trying to carve that out of the definition. And I'm going to give you an example. And I'm not picking on him, but it's a concrete example. Rob Reiner put out a documentary. And in that documentary, he's basically labeling people, saying you are a Christian nationalist if you are if you're pro-life. If you're not for same-sex marriage, you are the bad Christian. And this Christian, who basically maybe may live on the surface, and again, I'm not perfect, but they don't believe or espouse the beliefs of the church. You could be Catholic, you could be a Protestant, you could be evangelical, whatever, but you don't espouse those teachings. You support them through your vote, you support them in your conversations, you support contraception because you contracept. All of these things, you're a good Christian, but these are the bad Christians. And in doing that, it justifies when they get theirs because you are bad. And I think this is an intentional split because language is important. If you want to create an enemy, you have to define an enemy. And I do think that that is going on in the culture. And I do think that it's on purpose to do that because we absolutely stand against their lifestyle, their choices, and they view us as an enemy. What are your thoughts?
All right, that's a great comment, and I've got a lot of thoughts about it. But just to pick up one thread of what you said, much of, I mean, I agree with every bit of it, actually. Um, you know, the secularists and the anti-Christians are really in an untenable situation because I'm not the only one to say this. When I do my more cultural kinds of books, the very appeal to human dignity and respect toward others that they invoke is a Christian, or if you want, a Judeo-Christian concept that most cultures don't do this. Most cultures, there are tribes, there are castes, there are rulers, there are subjects. Um, I have no problem with the United States being a Christian nation in a certain sense. You know, I don't mind being called a Christian nationalist in a certain sense either, because those Christian values like respect for human liberty, respect for human conscience, etc., come out of our tradition. If you want to try, I often, if somebody comes at me in the way that you're talking about people coming at you, what I say to them is, well, wait a second. Let me ask you this. On what basis do I have to respect you and your position and your positions or opinions about this? I mean, why? You know, if you believe in evolution, well, great. Okay, so you know we're kind of smart monkeys, and we are in a way. But that doesn't mean I have to respect you. You're just another animal. I mean, I'm an animal. You're an animal. I can do what I want to you. And why can't I do that? Well, the only reason we believe I can't do that is because you have a certain dignity. And why do you have a certain dignity? Well, it's not because the Constitution gives you a certain dignity, because the American Declaration of Independence says men have been endowed by their creator with rights. You know, in America, it is a Christian assertion about what human beings are and what human societies are that makes it possible at all to make the arguments that you're making. So yeah, I mean, look, they come at you, but we've got to go back against this. I mean, one of the things that I most appreciate that the Trump administration is doing, it's doing a lot of things. Some of them I hope work out. Some of them I think are already working out, but doing away with DEI, where we are forced. Several of my children work here in government offices and military positions in Washington. And when they tell me sometimes the DEI stuff that they have to go through, my son was put in a corner with some other white males and told, you guys are privileged, you guys are bad, blah, 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 you know. And he's like, what the heck? I'm a human being. You know, I've never in my life discriminated against another human being. What, you know, I don't, maybe I don't like the idea of trans, or I don't like the idea of gay marriage or whatever it is, but it's America and it's kind of live and let live, but you want to impose that on us. So, I mean, it's our own government. You know, we were talking earlier about how within our culture, there's this internal attack. And unfortunately, it's even within the church now. I mean, Joe, other Joe, you're talking about how it's imposed on you and there's this division by certain people who are intentionally doing it, but it's happening inside the church, our own church leaders. I'm not going to mention any names here, but I think that some of our purple-clad leaders in the American church are fostering that division just as much as people outside. So, look, it's a sad situation. All we can do is tell the truth and keep telling the truth wherever it is, whether it's on Veritas Radio or whether it's in a book or, you know, in whatever forum it is. But people ask me all the time, what do we do? I just say, you do whatever comes to hand because God puts you in a certain circumstance. Maybe you never expected to be in that circumstance, but you're there. He's asked you to be who you are, to remain faithful to him, and then we do, and let the chips fall. I mean, I'm not foolishly, but let the chips fall.
Right, right. I agree with you. I mean, and that requires courage. I mean, no question about it. And we have to be courageous, particularly in what we know is not a really. It can be aptly described as a culture war, but we know as Catholics it's a spiritual battle. This is a battle for the destruction of souls or the salvation of souls. One thing I'm glad you mentioned, Bob, before I throw it over to Joe, and we only have a few minutes left, is it's always if you really want to see some sort of like, I guess what you would call cognitive dissonance on the part of somebody who espouses moral relativism, all right? And you say, well, I think life begins at conception. I'm pro-life. I'm against gay marriage. Blah blah blah. So all truth is relative, except what you're saying. You're objectively wrong. You know, it's like they don't really have an argument on that philosophical level of being consistent. They don't have an argument. And then they go away with their tail between the legs, which I get a great deal of satisfaction from whenever we point that out to them. Joe Resinello, where do you want to go? We probably have about 6 minutes or so left, Joe.
I want to talk about, you mentioned this, Bob, not standing for it. Now, I'm familiar with your work. I've seen you on EWTN, on Raymond Show for years. I've read the Catholic thing. I know what you're about. And to be honest, I mean, I don't know if you know us. Not that that's significant, but Joe and I don't stand for it either. I'll be completely truthful with you. I have a big Italian mouth, and I use it. Every first Saturday, I pray publicly with men in front of churches all over Bergen County. I've been doing that for years, ever since Joe Biden was elected. I do not stand for it and will not stand for it. With that said, I don't see that amongst Catholics. I see that amongst Jews. I see that amongst Muslims. We have everything, and we don't use it. We don't use it. There was a time, and then I'm going to, hand it over to you, with Hollywood, the bishops, and I'm not going to turn this into a bishop bashing conversation, but they were just like, listen, you put this movie out, I'm going to tell my people not to go see it. So you're going to lose money. And that's what people understand, especially people with no shame. Money. And guess what? They move the dial. We have the biggest lobby out there. So many Catholics. Yet we just are passive. We let people walk all over us. We're expected to take it. And frankly, it's sickening. Let me be completely truthful with you. On a million different levels, it's nauseating. A, we have to get more vocal. And B, how can we be effective in being that person to stand up? I'm interested in your thoughts.
Well, pray a lot. I should begin with. We all need to be inspired and to, find ways to do what needs to be done. Um, Look, I'm very sympathetic because you would think that, as I said earlier, this is the only institution that can stand up to the craziness that's destroying our culture. And that's why the Catholic Church is attacked so much, frankly, because we're kind of the tallest tree in the forest, Um, but look, you can get depressed about this because we seem to be outnumbered. I often tell people who want to come to work for us at Faith and Reasons, to young people coming out of college, can you come to Washington and to work in a place where the other side has at least 1,000 people compared to every one that we have, that has at least $1,000 and probably $1 million for every dollar that we have to spend on our work, that has the media, the universities, much of the government behind it, and that you're going to have to stand up to a lot of abuse. If you can do that, you can probably come here and work. And it's a rewarding thing, but it's also a frustrating thing. But at the end of the day, we travel with hope. We've talked about grace. I mentioned prayer. But the image I like to bring before people's minds when they're wondering, what do we do next, is who knew that the Soviet Union was going to fall before it did? All right. The day that the Soviet Union fell, it still had all those nuclear weapons, still had probably the largest military in the world, most soldiers, tanks, planes, all that stuff. And yet it fell, and nobody knew it. The CIA didn't know it. The President of the United States didn't know it, although Ronald Reagan knew that it was hollow, and so did John Paul II. So it's a moral battle. Other Joe said it's a spiritual battle. And this is something I think Christians in particular have lost. We think that somehow we're going to be nice and everybody is going to, rally to our side. Jesus is nice a lot of the time, but he isn't always. Sometimes he tells some real hard truths to people. So look, we stay in the fight. We know that we're outnumbered. It's frustrating, and we've got to find the resources in prayer and thought and with other people. to continue working at this, but it is ultimately a spiritual battle. That is the vision of the Bible, that it's God and the devil vying for our souls and for our society, our children. And by the way, another thing, I mean, I've put a lot these days I really look at my charitable giving and I put a lot of money into immediate relief of organizations that I know are trustworthy. Like pro-life shelters for women who are pregnant outside wedlock and whatnot, but also education, because one of the weaknesses in the church is a lot of our people have never now been taught real Catholicism. Simple fact that over decades, a lot of our people just never got it. And so it's not going to be a quick fix. We've got to educate ourselves first and then also educate people. I mean, one of the things we have at our Faith and Reason and Catholic Things site is we have courses. I started this during COVID because a lot of people were at home and I don't know, it just hit me one day. I taught 3 courses on Dante. You two paisans will appreciate that. I mean, I had 1,000 people. I had 1,000 people reading the Inferno with me, the first course that we offered. Right now, we're offering a course on Bonaventure's The Soul's Journey into God. It's kind of like the mystical ascent. St. Bonaventure is a Franciscan. He's sort of contemporary with Thomas Aquinas. And he has this very short book about how the soul rises up to God. We've got to educate ourselves. I mean, we can't expect most of our Catholic universities, sadly, to do this. We can't wait on the bishops to do much of what needs to be done. We've got to do it ourselves and be creative and find a way to make things happen. As Benedict XVI often used to say, it's creative minorities that make history. And we got to be those creative minorities.
Amen.
You guys are doing it.
Amen, Bob Royal. I mean, that's a great place to end the conversation. So, Bob, the website again for Faith and Reason is
frinstitute.org. And more immediately, I would recommend people go to thecatholicthing.org and subscribe. It's free. I mean, you can also pay, but you can subscribe to everything that we publish at the Catholic Thing for free.
Well, one thing I always say is, like we spend our money on HBO and Cinemax and this and that and blah, 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 in this streaming network. We could throw $5-10 a month to the CatholicThing.org and other organizations that are doing this good work. Robert Royal, so great that you joined us here. The book, once again, The Martyrs of the New Millennium. Click the link in the description. Buy it from Sophia Press. You'll get a 15% discount because you know Joe and Joe, which is always a beautiful thing. Robert Royal, needless to say, you are welcome back here anytime. But Joe and I feel we always say we learn as much as our audience does. So we're just very grateful that you came, and we'd love to have you back whenever you're doing anything. We'd love to have you back. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Great to see you both.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you out there for joining us at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Thanks once again. And remember, until the next time, that our conversation is your conversation, and that conversation is going on everywhere. We'll talk to you soon.